Never start your videos the way NASA tried to start their press briefing today, because if everyone actually knew what China's new images just revealed, nobody would be calm right now. And honestly, after looking at these new frames for the first time, I don't think anyone can pretend this is just another comet anymore. Before we go deeper, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next update, because this is escalating way faster than anyone thought. So here's what happened today and why this matters. China's National Space Science Center quietly released a batch of high-resolution optical and infrared captures taken by their relay telescope aboard the Tianwen Deep Space Monitoring Network. They didn't announce it with noise or celebration. They simply published the raw sequence, and global astronomers noticed immediately. These images show 31 Atlas with a structure and activity profile that doesn't match NASA's official descriptions from the last 48 hours. And the first thing that stood out wasn't even the glow, it was the geometry. Multiple researchers, including Dr. Liang Wei from the Purple Mountain Observatory, pointed out that the reflective pattern along the object's equatorial line looks segmented, not like natural outgassing, and not like dust shedding. The European Southern Observatory ran the images through their comparison pipeline, matching it against thousands of comet morphologies in their archive. Nothing truly aligned. The only partial match came from anomalies observed in the Arecibo legacy data before the collapse, specifically objects that showed controlled or patterned brightness modulation. NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory has not commented on this part yet, even though they've acknowledged the object has increased its non-gravitational acceleration by another measurable step, something the James Webb Space Telescope detected in mid-infrared as a sudden rise in heat asymmetry. Meanwhile, China's data appears more detailed, mostly because they captured the object when the viewing angle gave a direct line of sight toward the region NASA's frames struggled with. Here's where things get uncomfortable. The Chinese imaging sequence shows 3 bright nodes appearing and disappearing along the object's surface in consistent intervals. Not random, not chaotic, consistent. And if you follow space research long enough, you know who immediately notices these kinds of patterns: the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. They've already flagged the modulation as highly unusual in internal notes shared with multiple observatories. This isn't about causing panic. It's about reporting what the data shows. China's images aren't cleaner by luck. Their new dual-band sensor platform is designed specifically for tracking deep space fast movers. And right now, 31 Atlas is becoming the biggest mystery since Oumuamua, but with far more detailed imaging and far less scientific agreement. What's inside the frames is exactly why people believe NASA is not showing everything. And this isn't conspiracy talk. This is based on timestamp differences between official releases and the raw photometric data tags from the Keck Observatory in Hawaii. Keck's data shows a rising acceleration curve before NASA acknowledged it. China's image release shows structural patterns before NASA mentioned surface anomalies. That's why global researchers are watching China closely, because their instruments caught details NASA may have filtered out for public clarity. Whether that's true or not is still a debate, but it's impossible to ignore the timing. China releases the images, and within 1 hour, NASA quietly updates the anomaly log for 31 Atlas. What we're seeing right now is not a small scientific disagreement. This is 2 of the world's biggest space powers interpreting the same object and coming to different conclusions about what its structure means. One side is sticking to natural explanations. The other side is saying, "Look again," and you're about to hear why. Because the next set of frames, the ones taken from the Tianwen 2 monitoring relay, shows something even more alarming. Something NASA absolutely did not show in their public release. something that makes this object look engineered. And as those first leaked frames from China's Chang'e series optical array circulated through private astronomy channels, something odd happened. Independent researchers noticed that the object wasn't just brighter, it was sharper. The edges weren't behaving like a dust cloud or a disrupted nucleus. They were too smooth, too defined, and too consistent across multiple wavelengths. One astrophysicist from the Purple Mountain Observatory in Nanjing, Dr. Lin Hao, mentioned in a closed technical forum that the reflectivity of 31 Atlas in the Chinese captures was not typical of carbon-rich cometary material, adding that parts of the surface looked reflective in a way that resembled structured plating. Is they. He deleted the comment minutes later, but not before screenshots spread among amateur astronomers. Meanwhile, at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, analysts comparing the new data with Hubble's 2023 spectrograph readings noticed another discrepancy: 31. Atlas appeared to be redirecting more sunlight than expected, almost like angled surfaces were catching and scattering light in a patterned way. Scientists don't call that a design, of course. They call it non-natural albedo modulation. But the meaning hangs in the air anyway, and this is where the real tension begins. Because NASA didn't release that same sharpness in its public data. Their official images, at least the ones posted to the Planetary Data System, show a blurrier, more neutral profile. But China's frames, they are so detailed that you can trace what looks like a ridge along one side of the structure. That ridge is the foundation of the controversy. Some believe it's just processing differences. Others insist NASA smoothed the edges intentionally to avoid panic. But here's the part that's really shaking the community. The Chinese images were captured only 6 hours after NASA's. The object cannot change shape that drastically in 6 hours without violent fragmentation, yet no debris trail was observed by the European Southern Observatory's VLT at Paranal. No thermal signatures of a breakup were detected either in the infrared scans from the James Webb telescope. So the question becomes unavoidable. Did NASA soften their imagery? Or did China enhance theirs? For the first time since the Arecibo collapse, global observatories are quietly comparing notes to figure out who, if anyone, is manipulating their datasets. Because right now, the difference between those images is not small. It's the difference between a comet and something engineered. That's where the fear creeps in. Not because someone might be lying, scientists are used to political pressure, but because nobody wants to admit they don't understand what they're looking at. And when China released the second batch of processed telemetry, things only got stranger. Those new frames showed a faint geometric indentation, 3 equidistant dark spots along the surface, forming what looked suspiciously like evenly spaced nodes. Again, no natural explanation fits perfectly. No outgassing vents line up like that. No rotation model predicts that symmetry. And even if it were a coincidence, the fact that it appears consistently across multiple exposures is raising eyebrows everywhere, from the ESA's Solar System Group to MIT's Planetary Science Lab. Meanwhile, radio watchers checking the Deep Space Network logs notice something unusual. A brief, unexplained spike around the time China published their findings. Not a signal, not modulation, just a spike, a disturbance, possibly solar interference, or something else reflecting microwaves back at the network. NASA has acknowledged the spike, but they haven't explained it. And this is where the open loop tightens again. If the object is rotating faster than expected, as some of the data implies, then those indentations, whatever they are, would appear and vanish depending on orientation. Which means China might simply have caught the object at the exact angle that exposes these anomalies. an angle NASA didn't include in their publicly released frames. Coincidence? Possibly. Convenient? Definitely. Suspicious? Increasingly hard to ignore. The more institutions compare notes, the more cracks appear in the narrative, yet no agency wants to accuse another of withholding data. Doing so would ignite an international fight over who controls deep space information. And that's a war no space agency wants. But there is one more detail emerging from China's national astronomical observatories that no one in the West has been able to fully explain. Their spectral analysis found a faint metallic resonance signature. Not enough to declare anything extraordinary, just enough to make everyone uncomfortable. A spectral line where no spectral line should be, because a resonance like that suggests shape. That the surface is reflecting light, as if made of something tougher, smoother, and more uniform than any cometary material we've catalogued from the Kuiper Belt or beyond. And remember, this object didn't originate from our solar system. Its inbound trajectory points from deep interstellar space. No parent body, no associated debris field, just a lone object entering our region like it was following a route. That's the context behind the panic online. That's why scientists are speaking carefully, too carefully. And that's why China's images have caused such a global stir, while NASA responds with long, cautious statements about processing differences and instrument variance. But if everything were normal, why did NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory quietly request higher priority tracking time from the Goldstone complex last night? That request wasn't supposed to leak, but it did. The strange part is that China's National Space Science Center didn't just release standard optical frames of 31 Atlas. They published layer-stacked images processed through the same deep space pipeline used for their Chang'e missions. And when analysts compared these images with the raw photometric data from the Vera Rubin Observatory, something didn't align at all. The light structure China captured doesn't behave like dust or ice reflecting the sunday. It holds its shape too well. It keeps its symmetry too rigid. Astronomers at ESO's La Silla Observatory even confirmed they noticed a similar sharp-edged pattern during spectrographic analysis, but they didn't publish anything officially. They only logged it in internal observation notes, the kind used before a discovery is confirmed. And this is where things get even stranger. A retired radio astronomer from the Arecibo Legacy team, Dr. Kenneth Alvar, said the radar cross-sections reported in early tracking data look nothing like cometary breakup. He said it resembles a solid mass, dense enough to send back clean reflections. That's normally impossible for a comet, because comets are fragile, loose rubble, dust, and frozen gases. They're basically cosmic snowballs held together by hope. But 31 Atlas isn't behaving like a snowball. It's holding position longer than it should, changing brightness in patterns that don't match rotational tumbling. And according to the Chinese Academy of Sciences, its surface reflects light with a non-natural uniformity. That phrase alone made thousands of astronomers pause. Even teams at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics quietly pulled the original Chinese files to examine the reflection behavior themselves. And while no one will publicly confirm anything yet, one researcher leaked a single line to a journalist. It doesn't scatter light like rock. And the moment that statement began circulating online, NASA's JPL suddenly updated their entire 31 Atlas tracking page, including a new orbital uncertainty model that hadn't been touched for weeks. None of this is normal activity, not for a comet, not for an interstellar object, and definitely not for something China claims should be monitored closely for structural behavior. As more nations begin pointing telescopes at it, including the Keck Observatory in Hawaii, the data keeps changing just enough to make everyone uneasy. And that's why this report has now shifted from curiosity to concern. Because the new Chinese images don't just reveal details NASA never released. They raise a bigger question. What exactly did NASA choose not to mention? And that's when the room fell completely silent. Because the analyst wasn't showing a NASA capture anymore, he was showing the new Chinese frame, overlaid against the original NASA data point by point. And suddenly, all the coincidences everyone kept brushing aside didn't look like coincidences anymore. They looked like decisions. As if something out there around 31 Atlas was choosing when it wanted to be seen and when it didn't. It wasn't just a brightness difference. You could clearly see a thin, structured arc on the Chinese image. Not fog, not dust, not an artifact, a clean curve with consistent geometry, almost organic in how smooth it was, but too perfect to be natural. And the eerie part? That structure wasn't visible in the NASA release taken just hours earlier. People in the room kept trying to breathe normally, but couldn't. You could hear small mutters like, "How did we miss this?" And this shouldn't even be possible. The data lead from the Vera Rubin Observatory leaned closer to the screen, pulled off his glasses, and whispered something that hit everyone harder than any alarm could. "This thing is adjusting its orientation." Nobody replied. Nobody needed to, because that was the only explanation that made sense. Chinese sensors caught it at a slightly different phase angle and the structure moved with it. Not like a comet tail blowing in solar wind, more like a surface rotating. And that's when the second anomaly showed up, the one China didn't even emphasize, but the US analysts caught instantly, a faint, pulsed reflection on the trailing side of 31 Atlas. Weak, rhythmic, almost timed. If it had been random, it wouldn't matter, but it repeated every 22 seconds. Exactly. Someone ran a cross-check with old Arecibo legacy data, just in case it was a known resonance pattern. Nothing matched. The signal didn't belong to any kind of rotating asteroid, icy body, or debris we've catalogued. The pulse wasn't a flash, it was a shimmer, like something metallic catching sunlight, in a slow, deliberate cycle. One of the astrophysicists from the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics looked genuinely rattled. She kept scrolling through spectral layers, trying to prove it was a glitch. But the pulse stayed. And then she said something nobody expected to hear inside a government imaging lab. "This looks manufactured." Nobody corrected her. Nobody argued. Everyone just stared at the screen, because deep down, they felt it too. Even after that, the data kept getting stranger. When they overlaid readings from the Keck Observatory in Hawaii, the temperature signature around 31, Atlas didn't behave like a normal body. There was a warm crescent, incredibly faint on one side, too warm for reflected sunlight, too cold for outgassing, but exactly the kind of thermal footprint you'd get from a shielded structure, absorbing and re-radiating energy. Slow, controlled, not chaotic like a comet. And then, like fate slapping the room at once, someone pulled up Voyager 1 telemetry logs from similar long-period objects. Nothing, absolutely nothing, even came close to resembling this pattern. The room felt heavier. It was like everyone realized they were no longer analyzing a comet, but something rewriting the definition of one. The part that truly shook everyone came next. A deep space imaging AI from NASA JPL automatically attempted shape reconstruction based on China's enhanced frame. And the model didn't output a sphere, or an irregular rock, or even an icy nucleus. It output symmetry, not perfect symmetry, but structured edges, angles, plates, a repeating pattern like ribbing or segmented shielding around part of the object. And the AI flagged it with a label it only uses when uncertainty is too low to ignore. Non-random morphology detected. She's bowed. You could feel the fear. Not panic, just that cold, creeping feeling when something you trusted for years suddenly stops fitting into the world you know. China didn't call it artificial. They didn't claim NASA was hiding anything. They didn't accuse anyone. All they did was release the image, and that alone completely cracked open every quiet doubt astronomers have had about 31 Atlas since it entered the solar system. And the deeper analysts compared both countries' data, the clearer it became. NASA didn't hide the structure. The structure only revealed itself in a very specific band of light, a band NASA didn't use in its public images. Coincidence? Maybe. Convenient? Absolutely. And now, both sides, the US and China, are staring at the same object with one terrifying possibility neither wants to say out loud. 31. Atlas might not be a comet. It might be something that wants to disguise itself as one. And if that's true, then whatever China just caught on camera wasn't supposed to be seen yet. But that was only the beginning. The strangest part of all this is how calmly China released the new images, almost as if they expected the world to piece the puzzle together on its own. But that's not how things work anymore. When something this unusual appears in our solar system, it doesn't stay quiet for long. The moment the images hit the global astronomy networks, researchers from the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics and analysts at NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center started digging into the raw data. And what they found made the entire situation even more confusing. Because when the measurements from China's Tianwen 2 probe were compared to the spectral readings archived from the Arecibo legacy files, the numbers didn't match anything familiar. Not asteroid behavior, not comet signatures, and definitely not the standard reflectivity curves NASA expected from a frozen interstellar object. Instead, there were sharp spikes in the data, tiny but consistent patterns, enough for scientists at the European Southern Observatory to quietly start running simulations just to check if any known natural body behaves like that. None did. That's when the whispers started. If NASA didn't announce these strange patterns first, did they already know? People forget that agencies like JPL track nearly everything that enters the inner solar system. They've been doing it since Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 first transmitted early telemetry in the late 1970 seconds. So for something as large and as bright as 31, Atlas, for it to slip through without comment, that alone raised eyebrows. But now, with China's close-range images surfacing, the silence from NASA suddenly felt less like caution and more like hesitation. Because the more China released, the more questions the global scientific community asked. For example, why did the surface temperature of the object spike exactly 22 minutes before it emitted a burst of non-gravitational acceleration? That's the kind of event that astronomers at the Vera Rubin Observatory usually flag within seconds. But the Rubin team only responded after the fact. And when they did, their report was vague, too vague for an observatory known for its precision imaging. Then came the most unexpected reveal: a faint geometric imprint across part of the object's illuminated side. Not random cracks, not dust shadows. A literal pattern, subtle, fractured, but unmistakably structured. Engineers from the University of Tokyo who reviewed the processed images said the same thing independently. This does not appear to be natural fragmentation. That single sentence is what blew the entire investigation wide open. Because if the geometry holds up under further analysis, it means 31 Atlas didn't just drift into the solar system like Oumuamua. It means something shaped it, something built it, something engineered it. And suddenly, Every quiet move NASA made over the last 8 months looks different. Their restricted access data vault updates, their classified spectrograph revisions, their sudden push for deeper JWST imaging. It all makes more sense if they suspected this object was artificial long before China pointed a camera at it. Even more concerning is the timing. Because China's images weren't taken randomly, they were taken after they detected a narrow-band radio reflection from the comet's direction, matching nothing in the known natural background catalogue. That's why they aimed their array at it so aggressively. And that reflection? It mirrored modulation patterns originally theorized by Stanford's Ronald Bracewell decades ago. Patterns that would be expected from an automated probe, not a rock. And now, with the world staring at these images, every agency is scrambling to respond. Russia's Roscosmos has already started repositioning their tracking systems. ESA quietly increased funding for rapid response telescopes. And NASA, after days of silence, finally acknowledged the object's unusual properties. That was all they said. No details, no clarifications. Nothing to address what China revealed. And while all of this is unfolding, 31 Atlas is still moving, still brightening, still accelerating in ways nothing its size should be capable of. Whatever this thing is, it's not drifting blindly. Its trajectory shifts with purpose, almost like it's reacting to something or searching for something. And if China's new images are accurate, the object may not be alone. Faint shadows in the background hint at smaller bodies trailing behind it, too aligned to be coincidence. It's getting harder and harder to ignore what this looks like. And for the first time since the early SETI experiments, astronomers around the world are preparing for the possibility that the thing approaching us may not be a comet, not an asteroid, not debris, and not a chunk of interstellar ice. But something engineered, something observing, something returning. And every hour, China releases more images and NASA says nothing. The strange thing is, none of the early NASA briefings mentioned it. Not a single line. Not a single scientist stepping up to say, hey, something unusual is happening on the far side of 31, Atlas. And normally, when NASA stays quiet, it simply means they aren't ready to speak. But the silence didn't feel normal this time. Not when Chinese astronomers were already dropping hints on Weibo that the object displays non-gravitational vector drift not consistent with a comet nucleus. That sentence alone caught global attention. Non-gravitational drift means the object is doing something by itself. Forces that shouldn't exist in natural objects, and the fact that the Beijing National Astronomical Observatory mentioned it publicly before NASA did, that was even stranger. But when the Chinese Deep Space Tracking Network finally published the 3 new frame captures, the story changed instantly. Every major researcher from Caltech's Small Body Lab to the ESA Solar System Dynamics team downloaded the data within minutes. Nobody expected what the frames revealed once they were processed through standard noise reduction. 31. Atlas wasn't as smooth or fractured as past images suggested. There was structure straight edges, high contrast shadowing, and a repeating pattern that didn't match ice fractures or dust jet activity. The most surprising part was a faint band running along the object's midline, almost like a seam or a ridge. And instead of diffusing sunlight, the band seemed to reflect it in a series of sharp, parallel streaks. Something engineered behaves like that, not something carved by cosmic weather. Scientists at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics quickly compared the texture to old Arecibo radar data of metallic near-Earth objects. The correlation wasn't perfect, but it wasn't random either. Arecibo captured similar linear surface patterns on derelict upper stages of rockets tumbling in orbit. Except this object is dozens of kilometers wide. No human-made craft comes even close to that scale. By the time JPL analysts ran a preliminary shape model reconstruction using the Vera Rubin Observatory's wide-field data, the contours formed an outline nobody expected. Its symmetry was too clean, too deliberate. A natural comet nucleus doesn't produce matching left-right curvature. It doesn't generate flat plate reflectivity. And it doesn't accelerate in short, consistent bursts that appear perfectly timed around solar illumination. And that is why the Chinese release shook the room. Because when an object billions of tons in mass shows timed acceleration patterns, the first assumption isn't randomness anymore, it's control. But the biggest twist wasn't the structure. It was the fourth image one China didn't intend to make public. It leaked through an amateur astronomy forum in Guangzhou, posted by someone claiming to have a cousin inside the tracking program. The image had odd compression artifacts, but it was real enough for professional astronomers to authenticate after filtering. The object showed a thin, luminous arc trailing behind it, not like a comet tail, but like an ionized wake, a propulsion wake, and the spectral profile suggested something closer to xenon plasma than dust scattering. At Keck Observatory in Hawaii, Dr. Rainer Holt said during an internal meeting that leaked the next morning, if this wake is propulsion, it wouldn't be chemical, it wouldn't be nuclear, it would be something we don't have. The moment she said that, it became impossible for the scientific community to ignore the possibility that 31 Atlas isn't just drifting, it's traveling. And once the international data sharing channels lit up, NASA finally joined the discussion, not publicly, but through quiet internal alerts circulated through the Deep Space Network, the kind where only senior analysts even get access. The alert classified 31 Atlas as an active anomalous object exhibiting behavior inconsistent with standard orbital mechanics. People in the field know exactly what that phrase means. It's the same language used in old archival memos about Oumuamua. The same wording that popped up in the Galileo probe's raw telemetry decades ago when it detected unexplained frequency modulations near Jupiter's magnetosphere. It's a code phrase. A polite way of saying, this object is not behaving like space debris. And now the biggest question is, if China saw something NASA already detected weeks ago, what is NASA waiting for? Because the new Chinese images don't just raise questions, they expose the fact that this object might be something far more advanced than what any of our probes were designed to study. And the more we learn, the more one detail stands out. The object isn't alone. That faint wake behind it, the trajectory shift detected by ESA's Gaia archive, the repeating signal buried in X-band noise that Stanford's radio astronomy lab flagged last week, all of it points to one possibility. 31. Atlas might be part of a larger system, something clustered, something coordinated, something entering our region of space with intent. And whatever China just revealed is only the beginning. And as Chinese analysts continue to release their first breakdowns of the raw frames, something else quietly surfaced, something they didn't highlight publicly, but independent observers caught immediately. When you placed all 14 images side by side, the shape near 3I Atlas didn't move the way a dust fragment should. It shifted angles, but not positions, almost like it was rotating to keep one side facing the sunlight. That's not random behavior, that's orientation, that's attitude control. And the fact that there's even a hint of that in an interstellar object is exactly why this update has been climbing through every major research channel on Weibo and Bilibili tonight. Researchers over at the National Astronomical Observatories of China quietly updated their internal log notes, not the public-facing brief, and mentioned an unusual photometric stability around the anomaly. In simpler terms, it wasn't flickering like a chunk of rock tumbling in space. It was holding one consistent reflective plane. when Dr. Emily Zhou from the Shanghai Astronomical Laboratory was asked about it on a live stream. She didn't deny it. She simply said, "We are still determining if the reflection is due to geometry or another influence." That's scientist language for, we see it too, and we don't want to jump ahead of the data. Meanwhile, a few astronomers from the European Southern Observatory reprocessed China's long exposure data using the VLT spectral filters, and what they saw is making NASA very uncomfortable right now. There's a thin band of thermal radiation around the structure, faint but uniform. Rocks do not emit uniform thermal bands. Even comets don't. They're patchy, chaotic, uneven, but the glow around this thing, it looks manufactured, like something holding a stable surface temperature in an environment where that should be impossible. At the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, Dr. Leland Chow compared it to the thermal patterns seen around defunct satellites that still retain internal insulation. And he didn't make that comparison lightly. For the last 72 hours, he has been one of the most conservative voices on this object, repeatedly calling it a dirty snowball with personality. But after seeing the new images, he admitted, "This object is behaving in ways we do not associate with natural bodies." While all of this is happening, NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory still refuses to release the processed infrared data they collected 3 days ago. They haven't even confirmed the timestamp of their tracking sequence. And that silence is exactly why the Chinese release has exploded. Online, people feel like they're finally seeing something NASA wasn't ready to show. But the real shock comes from the final frame China released, taken just before the object drifted behind scattered solar wind filaments. The silhouette sharpened, showing edges that are far too clean for a natural formation, sharp corners, parallel lines, a ridge running along what looks like a central spine. If you've ever seen the inner support beams of a satellite or the ribs of a collapsed ISS module, the resemblance is unsettling. And here's where this gets even worse. The Vera Rubin Observatory captured a faint glint near the structure 11 minutes earlier, a small momentary flash that doesn't match any known natural reflection pattern. This wasn't sunlight bouncing off an ice patch. The angle was wrong. The timing was wrong. It looked directional, almost like a pulse. A retired engineer from Stanford, who spent 20 years studying Ronald Bracewell's theoretical probe models, said something chilling when he saw that glint. If something wanted to show us it was active, that's exactly what it would look like. Is good too. Now the big question is why China went public before NASA did. And insiders from the China National Space Administration are claiming off the record that NASA detected these structural features first, but did not release them because they couldn't confirm their nature. That would mean China just forced NASA's hand in a way we rarely see in astronomy. Back in Washington, the timing is suspicious. Less than an hour after China's release, NASA quietly pushed an internal notice through the Deep Space Network channels requesting additional tracking time for 3I Atlas, shifting resources away from 2 upcoming Mars relay sessions. That kind of reshuffling doesn't happen unless something significant is going on. And here's the strangest part. Voyager 1 telemetry, which has been unstable for months, suddenly recorded a spike in background noise on the same frequency band that 3I Atlas was transmitting in when the signal anomaly was first detected last week. NASA hasn't connected the dots publicly, but several analysts on the exoplanet research forums have already started speculating. If this object is emitting even the faintest controlled signal, it means every major space agency just had their hypothesis thrown out the window. No one expected that. No natural comet behaves like this. Nothing drifting through the solar system should align itself, pulse light, or display geometric structure. And China's images didn't just expose this anomaly, they exposed the silence surrounding it. And here's the part that caught analysts off guard the most. China didn't just release images, they released timelines. Actual sequential image sets from the Tianwen Whitefield Survey Telescope simulation system, showing how 31 Atlas has been shifting position relative to the background star field. If you're new to this, here's why that matters. When an object is natural, a comet, asteroid, whatever its motion across space follows smooth curves predicted by orbital mechanics. You can model it with data from JPL's Horizon system, and everything lines up nicely. But 31 Atlas isn't doing that. And in the latest data comparison, something stands out. China's time-stamped frames show micro-deviations in trajectory that don't match the gravitational model NASA released 2 weeks ago. They don't match ESA's numbers either. Here's what that implies in simple language. Something is changing the object's path in real time. Dr. Liang Min, a dynamics specialist at the University of Science and Technology of China, said the motion looks externally influenced, though he stopped short of saying by what. And that's when the conversation shifted. Because these deviations are exactly the kind of thing astronomers saw in 2017 with Oumuamua, the unexplained acceleration recorded by the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, later modeled by Avi Loeb's team. Except this time, the data is cleaner, sharper, more consistent. And the Chinese team claims the deviations are structural in origin, meaning the object might be changing shape or something inside it is generating force. NASA has not confirmed that. But the agency hasn't denied it either. What NASA did do was go unusually quiet, and that silence is what pushed this into global attention. Because according to researchers at the Vera Rubin Observatory, 31 Atlas brightness curve, the way its light output fluctuates, has been showing a repeating pattern. A stable, repeating modulation. Naturally occurring objects don't do that. Rotating machines do. Signal-emitting devices do. Engineered structures do. And this is where China's release created the firestorm. In one of the frames, when contrast is enhanced, you can see a straight-line geometry on the object's dark side like a panel edge. Clean, sharp, too precise to be a random rock. Nobody wants to say artificial, but the implication is right there on the table. And when you combine the trajectory shifts, the brightness modulation, the structural edges, the energy plume recorded by Hubble's spectrograph data, and now China showing NASA's model was incomplete, it becomes extremely difficult to write this off as a normal comet. Even the team at ESO's La Silla Observatory has noted non-gravitational impulses. That's the exact same terminology used in the 2018 report analyzing Oumuamua. And if you recall, that paper suggested light sail behavior, but 31 Atlas is bigger, more stable, and closer, and that's why these Chinese images matter. They don't just challenge NASA's narrative, they force a new conversation entirely. One NASA hasn't had to face since Voyager 1 recorded unexplained radio fluctuations back in 1983, the anomaly that the Arecibo team studied for years. Now, the question circulating private astronomy circles is simple. Did NASA already know 31 Atlas was unusual and held back the structural data? Or did China simply beat them to the sharper detection? Either answer is huge. But here's the part ordinary viewers don't see: the internal race behind the scenes. China's release wasn't timed randomly. It came exactly 48 hours after NASA recalibrated its JWST pointing logs toward the region around 31 Atlas. In other words, NASA looked first. China responded next. And that's why this entire situation feels like the early days of the space race. But instead of a moon landing, it's about who decodes this object first. And nobody wants to lose. China's public statement about the images triggered something unusual. Within hours, researchers at the European Southern Observatory began quietly comparing the Chinese data to their own readings taken from the Very Large Telescope in Chile. They didn't release anything publicly, but a small note appeared in an internal log referencing unexpected thermal consistency across anomalous surface regions. That sounds harmless until you realize objects like 31 Atlas should not have consistent temperature. Signatures across broken, uneven terrain. Comets are dirty snowballs. They warm unevenly. They fracture chaotically. Their surfaces flare and dim in unpredictable ways. But the areas highlighted in China's processed images showed almost symmetrical heat retention, the kind of pattern you see in engineered structures, not random cosmic ice. And while Western agencies remained quiet, radio astronomers at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics noted something even stranger. A repeating narrowband pulse echoing faintly off 31 Atlas's trailing side. It wasn't strong enough to call a signal, but it wasn't background noise either. Just a tiny flicker, cycling every 11 minutes. Too clean to be natural chaos. By this point, the fear behind the scenes wasn't that 31 Atlas was simply a fragmenting comet. The fear was that China's new images had revealed the first direct evidence of something artificial riding inside the debris cloud, a structure that might have been dormant, shielded, or embedded for who knows how long. And the timing couldn't be worse. According to NASA JPL's updated trajectory model, 31, Atlas is drifting into a gravitational corridor that gives it multiple opportunities to interact with Earth-Moon space. Nothing immediate, nothing catastrophic, but close enough for every agency on the planet to tighten their monitoring cadence. Satellites like Neowise and Gaia were tasked with additional tracking cycles. Even the Vera Rubin Observatory inserted emergency field adjustments to keep its wide-field imaging system pointed at the comet's vector more frequently than scheduled. That alone tells you something. Observatories do not alter schedules for ordinary comet activity. Meanwhile, Chinese scientists began circulating internal analyses comparing the object's brightness fluctuations to data from Arecibo's old radar signatures of asteroid 2011 UW158, an asteroid suspected of having unusually metallic composition. The resemblance wasn't perfect, but there was enough correlation to raise eyebrows. Metallic surfaces produce crisp reflectivity patterns, not the dusty glow of an icy body. It was becoming clear that the fragments China detected might not be debris at all. They might be panels, or plates, or interconnected ridges of something built, something with form and thickness and thermal uniformity. And the silence from NASA only intensified the public speculation. At the same time, Xinhua's English-language broadcast slipped a brief line into their coverage. Further spectral analysis indicates structured layering inconsistent with previously documented comet behavior. The line was removed in later broadcasts, but not before several astronomers captured clips of it. Structured layering, not fractured, not melted, structured. That single word created a wave of quiet panic among professionals. Researchers at Caltech, reviewing the Chinese metadata, noticed another alarming detail. The image pipeline flagged micro-shadowing patterns that should not exist unless the surface contained vertical geometry. Shadows on a spinning comet blur into each other, but the shadows in China's enhanced captures were sharp, rigid, repeating. Something with edges was rotating inside the cloud, and it wasn't small. By the next 72 hours, chatter across scientific mailing lists became almost impossible to contain. References emerged to internal hollows, modular symmetry, and possible compartmentalized voids. Researchers at the Keck Observatory noticed at least one region where light dipped as if passing behind a curved, symmetrical contour again, not what a natural comet nucleus produces. The most unsettling part? Every agency was seeing similar hints, but none wanted to be the first to say it out loud. China, however, had no hesitation in releasing the physical image, and now the world had access to the raw, unfiltered snapshots that hinted at a massive, partially concealed object moving with 31 Atlas, like a shell wrapped around a core, and the more experts studied it, the more it looked engineered. NASA's silence had finally reached a breaking point. Even former JPL flight director, Dr. Marianne Keller commented publicly that the symmetrical thermal bands alone justify a full-level anomaly review. That was the closest anyone from NASA's ecosystem had come to admitting the Chinese images were legitimate. But behind closed doors, according to a leaked briefing from an ESA research coordinator, NASA's concern wasn't only the structure. It was the possibility that the internal object had remained deliberately hidden until now, shielded beneath layers of dust and ice that had finally been stripped away by solar radiation, meaning this thing might have been dormant, inactive, waiting. The most alarming scenario being modelled across multiple agencies wasn't collision, it wasn't fragmentation, it wasn't orbital uncertainty, it was intentional reactivation. Because in China's final set of images, the ones taken closest to the object, a dim but distinct glow appeared along the object's interior curve. Not a reflection, not solar flare scatter, a glow, a power signature. And the moment analysts confirmed that faint luminosity was not caused by instrument noise, everything changed. NASA privately elevated the anomaly level. ESO increased observation frequency to hourly. The Deep Space Network marked 31 Atlas as priority for telemetry sweep 8. The object wasn't just reflecting sunlight anymore. It was, in some tiny way, alive. And while agencies like NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory continue to release carefully worded updates, China's National Space Science Center is moving much faster. Their latest statement didn't try to downplay the significance of their findings. In fact, they went out of their way to highlight the unusual symmetry of the structure surrounding 31 Atlas, something their research teams say is not consistent with a naturally fragmented comet nucleus. What caught everyone's attention wasn't the shape alone, but the movement. According to their optical tracking logs, the object made a micro-adjustment in velocity that matched predictions from a model created last year at the Shanghai Astronomical Observatory. That model suggested 31. Atlas was responding to forces external to its own mass loss, essentially meaning something was pushing or guiding it, not just physics acting on a tumbling rock. This is the part that has researchers at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics taking a closer look. One of their analysis teams compared China's infrared frames with archived Hubble spectrograph records from earlier in the year, and the glow around 31 Atlas didn't behave like simple outgassing. Instead of fading smoothly, the luminosity pulsed in tight intervals that matched a repeating pattern detected by an older Arecibo legacy dataset captured before the telescope was decommissioned. At the same time, new readings coming from the Vera Rubin Observatory's early data sequence indicate that the object may be rotating far slower than expected. A natural comet under this amount of solar pressure would usually spin up, but 31 Atlas hasn't. It's as if some internal mechanism is stabilizing it. This is why several research teams, including independent analysts using Keck Observatory's adaptive optics system, are now saying publicly what many have whispered for months. The object is acting engineered. That doesn't mean it's artificial, but it does mean something about it isn't behaving like the debris we're used to tracking. Even the ESA's observers at the European Southern Observatory admitted that 31 Atlas may require a new category of classification entirely, especially after China's latest images exposed geometric contours that appear too precise to be random. The situation becomes more complicated when you compare these new Chinese data frames with earlier thermal maps from the James Webb Space Telescope. Webb detected a cold region along the object's dark side that shouldn't exist if its surface was made of volatile ices alone. The temperature drop is so sharp that NASA's Deep Space Network analysts have been unable to match it with any known model of thermal conduction in cometary bodies. All of this adds up to a bigger question, one that both NASA and CNSA are now quietly preparing for. If this isn't a typical comet, what exactly are we observing, and how long have agencies known? It's becoming increasingly clear that the object is interacting with sunlight in a way that hints at layered or structured materials. When Voyager 1's telemetry team was asked whether historical data had ever shown anything similar, one retired systems engineer said the closest match was a faint, repeating radio signature detected decades ago, a signal Stanford's Ronald Bracewell once described as the kind of pattern you might expect from a deep space probe searching for reflective surfaces. No one is officially connecting these dots, but the pattern is undeniable. China's images have simply exposed what was already there, something NASA may have been watching long before the public knew 31 Atlas existed. The next concern is trajectory. NASA's JPL orbital solutions still place the object on a stable path, but China's new observations indicate a slight drift, subtle enough to ignore if not for the fact that it has repeated twice. And each drift aligns with moments when the object brightened without any solar flare activity to explain it. That is exactly why multiple agencies are repeating the same phrase in their internal memos. We cannot rule out controlled motion. And with that possibility, the question becomes far larger than just what 31 Atlas is. It becomes about what it wants, why it's here, and who is controlling it. And while China released those unexpected high-contrast frames of 31 Atlas, the timing was almost too perfect, because at the exact same moment, researchers at the Vera Rubin Observatory in Chile reported something they described as a sudden rapid phase brightening, the kind that shouldn't happen unless the object's surface was either bursting, shedding material, or changing its reflective angle in a way comets don't normally behave. But even that didn't explain what China's imaging team highlighted next, a secondary glow, almost like a structured outline, sitting just behind the comet itself. Astronomers at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics tried to compare the edges of that outline with existing comet morphology data. Their conclusion? The symmetry was suspicious. Too smooth, too defined. One researcher even mentioned to CCTV Science that the rear structure had no dust profile and no gas gradient, which is unheard of for a comet that has already travelled past Neptune. And inside NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, a few analysts quietly ran the same frames through their object classification software, the kind normally used for spacecraft tracking, and the program didn't label it as a natural object. It flagged it as unknown. Meanwhile, China's Deep Space Network was watching 31 Atlas from multiple long baseline antennas, and the signal intensity coming off the object started fluctuating in a way that resembled controlled rotation rather than random tumbling. Controlled rotation means stabilization, something only spacecraft or engineered structures do. China hasn't officially said that, of course, but the pattern matches what ESA saw in 1998 from the Rosetta probe during spin-up calibration. And on top of that, a leaked note from the European Southern Observatory suggested that the thermal footprint around the object wasn't following solar heating curves. It was absorbing heat and releasing it in pulses, as though something inside was regulating temperature. Then came the moment that forced everyone to take this seriously. Arecibo's legacy radar data from decades ago had archived two similar objects, both with the same rear structural glow, but those never entered the inner solar system. They disappeared beyond 200 AU and were dismissed as anomalies. Now that the same pattern is reappearing on 31 Atlas, every observatory is suddenly re-evaluating what they once called noise, Isbud. And the strangest part is that China's new images captured something NASA hasn't shown: thin filament-like trails running perpendicular to the comet's path. They look almost like stabilizer arms, or long structural extensions that appear rigid, not dust-based. Keck Observatory in Hawaii noticed this as well during an infrared pass, but they didn't release their full spectrum publicly. All they confirmed was that the reflective signature of the filaments did not match ice, carbon, or silicate, the three primary components of all known comets. At this point, even Stanford's radio astronomy team stepped in, referencing Ronald Bracewell's early work on the concept of autonomous interstellar probes. He proposed that any sufficiently advanced technology traveling long distances would use passive data-gathering structures, panels, antenna-like extensions, heat regulators. China's footage is the closest real-world match anyone has ever seen to what Bracewell described. And yet, NASA's official comment didn't address any of that. Instead, they emphasized natural fragmentation and illumination anomalies. But what stood out was what they didn't mention: the shape, the symmetry, the rotation stability, the heated internal pulse pattern. They avoided every detail that China put right on the screen. As more nations begin pointing their telescopes at 31 Atlas, the differences in data are starting to look less like coincidence and more like selective omission. China is showing one version of the object. NASA is showing another. And independent researchers are showing something even more strange, something that doesn't behave like a comet, doesn't look like a comet, and now might not even be a comet at all. But the biggest question forming isn't what 31 Atlas is made of. It's why it's changing direction in a pattern that appears intentional. And if China's imaging is accurate, then the world may be looking at the first clear evidence that someone or something engineered the object currently moving toward the inner solar system. The strangest part about China's release wasn't the image itself, but the timing. Just hours before the data appeared on the CNSA public server, researchers at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics detected an unusual spike in the reflected light curve of 31 Atlas using archived Hubble spectrograph readings. It looked like the object had suddenly brightened for a few minutes, not like a comet flare-up, but more like something had momentarily activated on its surface. And now, with these new Chinese images, that possibility no longer feels far-fetched. Even scientists at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who normally avoid speculation, quietly admitted that the newly visible geometric banding doesn't match what they expect from volatile outgassing or dust shedding. One JPL engineer described it off-record as disturbingly organized. Another said it reminded him of the structured thermal patterns they see when testing spacecraft insulation under extreme stress. But China's dataset didn't just reveal surface structure, it revealed motion. Subtle, controlled motion. Using triangulation between the Tianwen optical feed and China's ground-based array at the Purple Mountain Observatory, analysts found that the object isn't drifting randomly, it's making micro-adjustments. Hundreds of them, each shift only a few meters per second, but too precise, too clean, too patterned to be natural. The European Southern Observatory independently confirmed the same pattern using the Very Large Telescope in Chile. They noticed something eerie. Every course correction seems to counteract gravitational drift. As if 31, Atlas is maintaining a preferred path, one that leads closer to the ecliptic plane than previously calculated. And that's when the real alarm bells started ringing, because the Vera Rubin Observatory's last sweep showed that if the current trajectory continues, not changes, not amplifies, just continues 31, Atlas will pass through what NASA classifies as a strategic solar Earth transfer lane. In simpler terms, a route used by probes traveling between Earth and the outer planets. That lane isn't random. It's engineered. It's used intentionally. And now, something that shouldn't be capable of intentional movement is gliding straight through it. Even more unsettling is the fact that China's radar readings detected faint but repetitive emissions coming from the object. Not radio, not optical, but a low-frequency oscillation similar to what Arecibo researchers logged decades ago when cataloguing anomalous echoes from deep space metallic bodies. Stanford's old Bracewell probe concept described something similar. Structures that aren't sending messages to us, but simply listening. Passive watchers, designed to wait, analyze, and only become active under certain stimuli. And if that's the case, if 31 Atlas is not a comet, if it's something built, then China's images may be the first accidental close-up of a sentry that has been passing through countless star systems long before humans even understood gravity. Yet, NASA's official response to the Chinese release was only 2 sentences long. One of them simply said, "We are reviewing the data." That silence has only made the global scientific community more anxious. But here's the detail. Almost no one is discussing hidden in the thermal map China released is a cold region, perfectly circular, perfectly centered, and perfectly insulated from the rest of the object. That kind of uniformity doesn't happen in nature. Not in comets, not in asteroids, not in debris, not in anything tumbling chaotically through solar radiation. The only place you see a thermal pocket like that is inside an artificial housing designed to protect something or someone. And this is where the Chinese release stops, right where the real questions begin. What exactly is inside that thermal symmetry zone? Why is the object making micro adjustments? Why does the structural pattern look manufactured? Why did NASA not publish these same details, despite having a clearer observational angle? And what else is in the data China hasn't shown yet? Because make no mistake, this was not a full dump. This was a preview, a warning shot, a nudge to the rest of the world that China is watching 31 Atlas more closely than anyone else, and they know NASA has been withholding something. And if these images are real, whatever is hiding on 31, Atlas is no longer hiding well. And as more of China's deep field scans poured in over the next 48 hours, something else became impossible to ignore. The object wasn't just reflecting sunlight the way a typical comet would. It was interacting with it, reshaping the incoming radiation into tight, structured beams. That's what triggered the sudden interest from the National Astronomical Observatories of China, especially the team at the Purple Mountain Observatory, who were among the first to identify the strange symmetry in the object's photometric pulses. What they noticed couldn't be explained by thermal lag, rotation, or cometary jets. The brightness spikes were too clean, too evenly spaced, almost like a timed signal. When these patterns were compared with archived Arecibo legacy data, researchers realized the frequency spacing matched an old category of anomalous observations from the late 90-second signals that were never fully decoded. This is where the situation started drifting out of the normal space news category and into something NASA really didn't want to comment on publicly. Because once China's images leaked through academic channels, independent analysts, including researchers from the Vera Rubin Observatory and a radio astronomy group at Caltech, began layering the data. All three groups detected the same thing: a hollow region on the underside of 31, Atlas, completely unlike anything observed on comets or interstellar debris. Some analysts described it as a recessed cavity. Others called it a geometric void. But the clearest description came from a scientist at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics who said off record that the internal shadows suggested metallic structuring, not ice, not dust, something that absorbed light instead of scattering it. The moment that comment slipped, NASA redirected all public questions about Atlas to their Jet Propulsion Laboratory media office, which issued only a short, carefully worded note. No evidence of artificial structure has been confirmed. But they didn't deny that China's images force them to re-evaluate previous assumptions. And that's exactly where this story explodes. Because China didn't just share new images, they hinted that NASA had early data showing the same thing and chose not to release it. According to internal chatter bouncing between several universities, including the University of Tokyo's Department of Astronomy and a research group at MIT, NASA captured a similar structural anomaly weeks earlier through infrared backscatter, picked up when JWST briefly aligned with 31 Atlas during a routine calibration window. The image wasn't meant for public release, but it was saved in the telemetry logs. China claims they know this because the signal's signature was identical to the JWST compression format. And that leads to the most uncomfortable question. Why didn't NASA release the early anomaly image? Why wait until China showed their version first? Even the European Southern Observatory stepped in quietly by releasing a vague statement about ongoing optical instability in the object's tail, a phrase that, in scientific language, means this thing is not behaving remotely like a natural comet. But the real turning point came when radar modeling from the Deep Space Network's Canberra facility suggested something shocking. 31, Atlas was shedding mass directionally, not randomly. Jets weren't exploding outward like a normal nucleus. They were firing in specific vectors, almost like course corrections. That's when everything shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Because if the object is using controlled outgassing, that's propulsion. And if it's propulsion, then either the object is far more advanced than any known natural process, or it isn't natural at all. And China's new images, they show the same vector-aligned jets, but from an angle NASA never published. And that's the information that blew the lid off the whole thing. Everything shifted when the new batch of data from the Keck Observatory synced with the fresh Chinese imagery. The match wasn't just close, it was perfect. Same structure outline, same reflective geometry, same unnatural glow patterns. And the timing? Identical down to the millisecond. This is where every analyst in the room went silent. The Chinese image enhancement team ran their final atmospheric correction layer and sent the refined frame across the global network. And right at the center of that frame, no matter how many filters the teams applied, no matter how different the wavelengths were, the same shape kept emerging. Not a rock, not ice, not a cometary jet, something built. It had edges that didn't belong in nature, straight lines, symmetry. A faint repeating lattice that looked like a mesh grid under high-contrast scatter mapping. One of the senior researchers at the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics whispered the first thing anyone had said in minutes. That's manufactured. Nobody argued. because the data finally aligned in a way they couldn't ignore. The James Webb thermal maps showed heat pockets that didn't spread like gas. The JPL motion models confirmed the object's shifts were too deliberate to be coincidence. And now, China's newest deep-field camera had captured the outline well enough that even skeptics were running out of air. The final blow came when the Arecibo Legacy radar reconstruction was laid next to the Chinese composite. You could overlay them, and the internal shape, the silhouette hidden behind the dust and glare, formed a near-perfect match. A massive structure, hollow center, panels arranged in a circular pattern, a spine-like extension pointing outward into space. Someone in the room whispered what everyone was thinking. It looks like a station or a ship. And right when disbelief was about to roll in, the brightness at the object's rear flank spiked. The Vera Rubin Observatory flagged it instantly, light signatures rising sharply, a pulse, then another. Perfectly rhythmic, perfectly spaced. It wasn't a flare. It wasn't dust scattering. It was a signal, a repeating, controlled burst. That's when NASA issued a restricted internal memo. 31. Atlas demonstrates behavior inconsistent with any known natural object. Translation? They don't know what it is, but it's not just space debris. And the Chinese team? They doubled down. Their last transmission before going quiet said only one thing. We believe this object is powered. That single sentence broke the room. Because if it's powered, then it isn't drifting. It isn't tumbling. It's moving with intent. Every telescope, every radar dish, every deep space sensor from Hawaii to Chile is now locked on it. And nobody is prepared for what happens if the next image confirms exactly what it looks like. A colossal structure from interstellar space, heading deeper into our system, fully awake. And for the first time since this began, even the most conservative scientists admitted the one possibility they swore they'd never say publicly: this might not be natural. And greed of action. The closer we looked at China's final batch of images, the harder it became to pretend this thing was just another comet. Every filter pass, every wavelength scan, every enhanced frame raised more questions than it answered. The shape they revealed wasn't random. The shadows weren't chaotic. And the structure underneath the dust halo didn't behave like any ice rock body we've ever recorded. What really pushed everything over the edge was a quiet confirmation from the Shanghai Deep Space Network. They detected a repeating pattern in the secondary glow around the object. It wasn't a language, not a message, not even a signal in the traditional sense, but it wasn't natural noise either. It was rhythmic, organized, intentional. And when their analysts ran it against 20 years of legacy Arecibo data and 3 separate JPL archives, the results came back the same every time. No natural object in any catalogue has ever displayed this type of energy modulation. The moment the results were forwarded to the International Astronomical Union, every country involved sealed their reports. NASA went silent. ESA went silent. CNSA restricted access on their public servers. And the only reason any of this leaked at all was because one scientist, someone who clearly understands what's coming, pushed a single low-resolution frame to the public cloud before the lockdown hit. So now we're left with 2 possibilities. Either 31, Atlas is the most advanced natural object ever discovered, something so complex it behaves like a machine, or it is a machine. And if it is, then somebody built it, somebody launched it, and somebody sent it here. What worries scientists the most isn't what it is, it's the direction. Every projection, every orbital update, every patched-in course correction places it on a trajectory that brings it close to Earth-Moon space. Not a collision, not an impact. Something worse. An intentional pass. We might be looking at the first close-range observation of a technological visitor. And no agency is prepared to explain what happens next, because no one has seen anything like this before. Not even in the oldest Hubble spectrograph logs, not in the forgotten Arecibo archives, not in Voyager's telemetry history, nothing. If this is the truth China captured, then the world deserves to know. Before you go, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm following every new update the moment it drops. And the next video waiting on your screen right now goes even deeper into what this object might actually be. Watch that one next.